Hello, everyone. This is BL Confession Room, a channel dedicated to telling forbidden BL stories that will leave you speechless. This story is about how the son of a wealthy alpha couldn't stop crying from birth until a poor omega appeared in his home. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories you won't be able to tear yourself away from. Write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Gabriel's son arrived in a world that had been measured, priced, and scheduled long before his first breath. The birth took place in a private clinic where even the silence seemed expensive. Lawyers had blessed every clause of the surrogacy agreement. The surrogate had signed, been paid, and disappeared with professional discretion. On paper, it was a perfect transaction, a healthy newborn. No complications, genetically confirmed heir for a man who was used to getting exactly what he paid for. Only one thing refused to fit the contract: the cry. From the first hour, the baby screamed as if someone had forced him out of a place where he had been safe and pushed him onto a cold, too bright stage. He did not calm down after feeding. He did not drift off when nurses rocked him. He reacted with raw, tearing hysteria to any sound, any smell, any shadow passing across the ceiling. In the nursery, nurses exchanged brief looks over their masks whenever his voice cut through the corridor. It was not the thin, rhythmic wail of a hungry baby. It was a stretched, broken signal, as if the child kept calling for something that did not exist in this room. One nurse murmured under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else, "This one does not know how to arrive in the world." Gabriel watched from behind the glass pane, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket so that no one would see his fingers tremble. Doctors and nurses took turns picking up his son, changing positions, adjusting blankets, trying different holds learned in training. Monitors glowed in soft green and blue, showing everything within normal ranges. Heartbeat steady, oxygen good, temperature safe. Physically, he is fine, they repeated, each report a neat paragraph of reassurance. The words shattered against the sight of that tiny, rigid body arching in distress. To Gabriel, they sounded like an accusation. If the body was fine, then the problem was somewhere else, in the room, in the air. Maybe in him. Days in the clinic blurred into a loop that had no beginning and no end. Examination, cry, diaper change, cry, feeding attempt, cry again. Time was measured not by the clock on the wall, but by the length of each scream and the short pauses between them when the baby's voice finally broke from exhaustion. The clinic selected the best staff for their most important clients. Nannies with polished resumes and calm voices came one after another. They tried all the soothing tricks they knew. Some lasted a few nights, some only a shift. They left quietly, admitting in low voices in the corridor that they had never seen a newborn who fought the world this hard. A neurologist with a neutral face and careful hands examined the child, checked reflexes, ordered scans. When the results came back, his tone did not change. No severe pathology, no detectable damage. In the final line of his report, he wrote what sounded so harmless on paper: heightened sensitivity, temperamental traits. That phrase clung to Gabriel like a bad joke. He was an alpha who had built a corporation by treating risks as numbers on a screen. If a project screamed, he could shut it down. If a market panicked, he could buy or sell and balance the sheet. Now, he stood helpless in front of a body that refused orders, a voice that ignored logic. At night, when the clinic dimmed its lights and the hallways sank into soft half-darkness, the crying did not stop. It seeped through the insulated walls of the VIP room, a raw, repetitive sound that made even seasoned nurses tighten their jaws. Gabriel sat in the armchair by the window, suit jacket thrown over the back, shirt sleeves rolled up, staring at the pale outline of the city outside. Every instinct taught to him since childhood told him to do something, to fix it, to push harder. But there was nothing to sign, nothing to pay for, no additional service to upgrade. There was only his son, red-faced and furious at existence, and his own reflection in the glass, looking back at him with a kind of unfamiliar fragility. "Maybe he is just more anxious than others," the pediatrician said on the third day, voice soft, almost apologetic. "Some children come into this world like that. They need more time, more contact, more body-to-body support. He listed recommendations in a practiced tone, an experienced nanny, a parenting course tailored for high-profile families. Patience. The word hung in the air like a foreign language. None of those lines answered the question that kept Gabriel awake. How was this child supposed to survive his own life if his first experience of the world was a continuous unanswered scream? On the last morning of their stay, paperwork arrived with polite efficiency. Insurance codes, discharge summaries, follow-up appointments. The doctor, by protocol, repeated his conclusions. No illness, no emergency. Just a baby who reacted more sharply than others. Gabriel signed where they pointed, listening with half an ear. In his mind, he replayed the loop of the past nights, the endless walks around the room with a howling bundle in his arms, the useless attempts to pass the child to someone else, only to take him back when the crying rose to a pitch that made his skin crawl. Some children are simply born more alarmed, the doctor said quietly at the door. They teach the adults around them a different way of living. Gabriel did not answer. He stepped out into the corridor, where the cry of his son followed him, sharp and desperate, already echoing like the sound that would define not only the baby's first days, but everything that would come after. On the other side of the city, Remy had learned to live like a person the system would never notice unless he made too much noise. He preferred not to. He moved through spaces where quiet, patient care was needed and rarely thanked. Postnatal wards with their dim lights, night shifts in small private clinics, apartments where wealthy parents paid someone to rock their infants while they slept behind thick bedroom doors. His resume was short and unimpressive on paper. No prestigious hospitals, no famous doctors ready to attach their names to his. But off the record, in corridors and staff rooms, there was one sentence that followed him from place to place. If a baby would not calm down for anyone, someone always said, almost automatically, try Remy. That so-called talent had not appeared out of nowhere. Years earlier, he had once carried his own child. The pregnancy had felt like walking with a glass vessel inside his body, terrified of every bump, every sudden movement. He did everything by the book, regular checkups, vitamins he could barely afford, food chosen with care even when it meant skipping a meal for himself. He saved links to cribs in online stores, comparing colors and shapes even though his account balance made it a fantasy. He imagined working from home, taking smaller night shifts, building his days around feeding times and naps. In those plans, there was always a small warm weight on his chest and a quiet belief that, just this once, life might make room for him. The miscarriage came late, at a point when he had already started talking to the child in his head. Pain arrived first, sharp and wrong, and then everything happened in a blur. Blood, emergency surgery, bright surgical lamps, voices that refused to attach to faces. The worst part was not the pain and not the recovery. It was the silence that followed the sentence, spoken gently but efficiently, that the heartbeat had stopped. Doctors talked about statistics, about chromosomal issues and fatal anomalies, about how nature sometimes makes this choice for you. For Remy, it felt less like nature and more like a verdict. Something inside him collapsed and did not rebuild. After that, he could not return to the version of himself who sat at a desk and smiled at clients, bringing them documents and coffee. Office work, once a dull but safe routine, now seemed obscene. It demanded that he pretend everything was fine while his body remembered an emptiness too large to hide under a company uniform. Instead, he gravitated toward places where crying was expected, where his internal noise did not feel so out of place. Maybe it was a form of punishment to surround himself with newborns when he had lost his own. Maybe it was the only way he knew to stay near the possibility of life, even if it no longer belonged to him. Working with infants, he began to notice things that others missed because they were too tired, too rushed, or too detached. How a baby's cry shifted rhythm when you changed the angle of their body. How the same child who flailed on a firm mattress melted against a warm chest. How the sound of a heartbeat, that constant drum they knew from the womb, could become an anchor when everything else overwhelmed them. His hands learned a language. A certain pressure along the spine, a slow sway to the left and then to the right, a way of tucking the blanket that made a baby's muscles release rather than brace. Sometimes a nurse would say, half joking and half relieved, "You have magic hands." Remy knew there was no magic. There was only a body that had been prepared to soothe its own child and had never been allowed to finish the job. His own body did not forget. There were nights when he held a screaming newborn for too long and felt a familiar dull ache in his chest, a ghost pain, a pulling heavy sensation as if milk could appear again if he just held on long enough. Doctors had called it residual hormonal echoes and trauma. He treated it like an old scar, something that tugged when the weather changed, something you learned to move around. He did not dream big anymore. His goals shrank to tangible, measurable things, paying rent for a small room with thin walls and a window that almost closed properly, buying hormone stabilizers to keep his omega body from swinging wildly between exhaustion and restlessness, keeping his phone charged so he never missed a call for an extra shift. His family had stepped away from him long before the miscarriage. For them, he had stopped being one of us the moment he said he wanted to raise a child without tying himself to an alpha he did not love. A strange idea in their world, and an unforgivable one when the pregnancy ended in loss. They spoke of him as if he had chosen shame on purpose. At some point, the calls simply stopped. Relatives became people he might pass in the street without recognition. Love stories, at least in the romantic sense, were something he read about or saw on screens. They did not fit into his schedule of night buses, antiseptic corridors, and grocery store discounts. The only bond he still believed in was the one between an adult and a child who needed them. That connection he trusted. That, he thought, he was still capable of not ruining. He poured himself into that role. He remembered the weight his own body had once carried and treated every newborn as if their fear of this new world was sacred, not annoying. While others reached for pacifiers and white noise machines, he offered heat, rhythm, patience. When exhausted parents handed him their screaming baby with a mixture of hope and guilt, he took them without judgment. He knew too well what it felt like to believe you were failing someone small and helpless. There were moments when, in the half-dark of an unfamiliar nursery, with a stranger's child pressed against his shoulder, he would close his eyes and feel the sharp edge of memory. For a heartbeat, he saw the crib he had never bought, the little clothes he had never owned, the future that had stopped before it began. Then, the baby in his arms would shift, whimper, seek comfort, and the ghost would dissolve into the simple act of being needed right now. He never stayed long in one household. His work was designed to be temporary. A few weeks, a couple of months, sometimes only a handful of nights until routine settled enough for parents to dismiss him with polite gratitude in an envelope. That was acceptable. Temporary felt safer. Permanent, he had learned, could disappear overnight. By the time the call from the private clinic came, asking if he could cover a night shift for a sick colleague, Remy existed in a narrow corridor between burnout and habit. He was tired, down to his bones, and yet incapable of saying no when the word newborn appeared in a message. He packed his worn backpack, checked that he had his ID and a clean uniform, and headed out into the evening. He thought it would be just another night in just another ward, holding just another child until dawn. He did not know that waiting for him was a baby whose despair would sound disturbingly like his own once had, and that the way his hands responded to that cry would change the shape of his life in ways he had long ago stopped expecting. The elite clinic looked almost gentle at night. Outside the windows, the city dissolved into dark shapes and scattered lights. Inside, the corridors glowed with a soft, expensive kind of brightness, the kind that never quite went out but never fully woke up either. Voices of on-call doctors drifted in low murmurs, phrases about test results and dosing schedules drifting past like pieces of another language. Remy arrived a little before midnight, as he always did. Habit made him move quietly, almost anonymously, from the entrance to the staff locker room. Fluorescent strips hummed overhead while he changed into the standard medical scrubs, folding his own clothes with a care that did not match their age. He heard the crying before he finished tying the strings at his waist. It cut through the muffled sounds of the building like a blade, not just loud but dense, as if the sound itself had weight. Each wail seemed to hit the walls, roll across the corridor, and come back stronger. If normal newborn crying was a wave, this was a storm siren. For a second, his hands froze on the knot. His body reacted before his thoughts a spelly. Heartbeat picked up, a strange mixture of dread and focus tightening his chest. It was a sound he knew too well, the kind that signaled not just hunger or a wet diaper, but a nervous system trapped in panic. In the nurse's station, a woman with tired eyes and a neat bun was bent over a chart. She did not even look up when he entered, just made a small mark with her pen and exhaled. "VIP baby is at it again," she muttered, in that dry tone of someone who had already gone through the full cycle of worry and helplessness. No one can get more than a few minutes of quiet from him. Remy simply nodded. He never liked to promise anything. But as he walked toward the room, the crying grew clearer, gaining edges and layers. Rage, fear, exhaustion. Underneath all that, a thin, breaking line that sounded almost like plea. The room itself was larger than many apartments he had known. A single transparent crib stood in the middle, surrounded by machines that blinked with calm, indifferent lights. Two nurses hovered nearby. One held a bottle, angling it toward a tiny mouth that kept rejecting the silicone nipple. The other checked the diaper, the temperature, anything she could think of for the third time in an hour. Their faces carried that particular frustration of professionals who had run out of options, but were still expected to perform. The baby looked like an overstretched wire. His little face was contorted, red and wet, mouth wide open on another scream. Fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were pale. His chest rose and fell in short, uneven bursts, as if his own lungs frightened him. In the corner by the window stood a man who did not fit the atmosphere of quiet restraint. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that pulled the eye even when he tried not to move. Gabriel. Remy did not know his name yet, but he recognized the posture, someone used to command, now reduced to watching. His suit jacket hung on the back of a chair. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing tense forearms. His expression did not match the image of an untouchable alpha. There was exhaustion there, an irritation aimed at himself, and beneath that, something raw and afraid. No one introduced them. In rooms like this, introductions felt like a luxury. Remy stepped closer to the crib and held out his hands in a silent question. One of the nurses glanced at the other, then at the man by the window. Gabriel gave the smallest nod. "If you can do anything," the nurse said, half joking and half desperate, "you are our hero tonight." Remy did not react to the word. He only slipped his hands under the baby's back and head, supporting the neck with practiced precision. The child's skin was hot and damp. The scream continued, but as he lifted the small body, something almost imperceptible changed in the sound. A flicker of hesitation, as if the baby had paused mid-cry to inspect this new contact. Remy drew the child against his chest, one hand cradling the head, the other supporting the bottom. The baby's legs kicked once, twice, then pressed closer to his torso. Still crying, but the wild thrashing eased by a fraction, he began to move. Not the big, frantic bouncing that anxious adults often tried, but a slow, consistent sway. A few careful steps forward, a pause, a shift of weight, a few steps back. His own breathing he deliberately slowed, letting each inhale and exhale stretch out. In small rooms with big feelings, breath could become weather. He knew that from too many nights like this, he did not speak full sentences. Words were often more for adults than for infants. Instead, he let a quiet murmur slip out, meaningless sounds threaded into a low, steady melody. The point was not what he said, but that his voice stayed calm while the baby's world was falling apart. Little by little, the curve of the baby's body changed. He was still crying, but the arch of his back softened. His fists loosened enough that his fingers no longer clawed the air. The volume dropped a notch, from piercing to merely sharp. Behind him, Gabriel watched with a kind of stunned focus. Relief hit first, rushing in as soon as the crying dipped even slightly. He felt it almost physically, like pressure lifting from his skull. Then, immediately, came the sting. Because this was happening in the arms of a stranger, not his. He had tried everything he knew. He had walked these same circles, had held his son until his own muscles burned, had followed the instructions of nurses and doctors and well-meaning family. Each time, the baby's screaming only escalated, as if his presence added weight to the fear instead of taking it away. Now, some Omega whose name he did not even know stepped in, and the child's body responded as if it had been waiting for exactly this kind of touch. It felt unfair. Irrationally, childishly unfair. Remy did not let any of that reach him. He could feel the eyes on his back, could sense the complex mix of gratitude and resentment in the air, but he kept his attention tethered to the small weight in his arms. There was no space here for his own history, no room for the echo of the child he had lost. If he let those ghosts in, his hands would tremble, and this baby needed hands that did not shake. Minutes stretched. The loop of screaming and swaying narrowed to a thin edge. The baby's cries broke more often now, replaced by hiccuping sobs. His face went from deep red to blotchy pink. His breath, while still quick, began to sync with the rhythm Remy set with his own chest. At one point, between one sob and the next, the baby's mouth closed fully. Silence, brief and fragile, slipped into the room. Everyone froze as if a sudden movement might shatter it. Then another cry came, weaker this time, like a habit trying to hold on. "Shh," Remy exhaled, the word barely more than an exhale itself. "You are not alone." He kept moving until his own legs felt heavy and his lower back started to complain. Finally, he eased himself into a recliner, never breaking contact. He adjusted the baby so the tiny head rested above his heartbeat, one small ear pressed against his chest. The clinic blanket rustled as he wrapped it snugly around them both. The scream had shrunk to small, uncertain noises, little protests, half-formed. The baby's eyelids fluttered, fighting sleep and yet desperate for it. Each time he jerked, Remy's hand slid along his back in the same slow path, shoulder to lower spine, again and again, spelling out safety in a language older than words. Gabriel moved closer, almost unconsciously, drawn by the quiet. He stopped at the foot of the recliner, close enough to see the faint tremor in Remy's fingers, the lines of exhaustion at the corners of his eyes. Up close, the Omega did not look like any kind of hero. He looked worn, pale, held together by focus and habit, but the baby in his arms was finally surrendering. The small body grew heavier, muscles releasing inch by inch. The little mouth opened in a yawn that came out as a soft hoarse sound, then closed again. Breathing slowed. One small hand, previously clenched, opened and came to rest against Remy's chest, as if testing that this solid, warm surface would still be there when he let go. "Finally," the nurse whispered from the doorway, not daring to step fully inside. "Finally he sleeps." Remy did not answer. He barely allowed himself to exhale in relief. In his experience, victory could vanish in a heartbeat. He stayed very still, every muscle aware of the baby's weight. Twice, he tried very carefully to shift, to see if he could slide the child back into the crib. Twice, the infant stirred at the change, letting out a warning whimper that rippled with the memory of earlier panic. He gave up on transferring him. If his own body had to be the bed for the rest of the night, so be it. His arms ached, his neck pulsed with a dull pain, and yet he remained exactly where he was, anchored by the simple fact that his stillness meant the baby's rest. Dawn crept into the room slowly, turning the window from black to gray to the faint outline of buildings. The monitors continued to blink their indifferent readings. In the recliner, Remy sat half-slumped, eyes heavy, a stranger's child pressed to his chest like something priceless and fragile. Gabriel watched as the first pale light slid across the floor and touched the blanket draped over Omega and infant. For the first time since his son had been born, he was looking at a scene that resembled peace. Not the polished image he had imagined for announcements and photos, but something more raw. A tired man in borrowed scrubs, holding a baby as if the world outside this chair did not exist. The baby slept on, face relaxed, breath even. For him, in that brief stolen stretch of hours, Remy's body had become an island in a world that hurt too much. Neither of them knew yet that this island would not vanish with the end of the shift, that what had started as one desperate night's work would become the fault line along which 3 lives would crack and rearrange. For now, there was only the quiet, the weight of a child against an Omega's heart, and the faint dizzy thought in Gabriel's mind that he had just witnessed something he could never completely control. After the shift, Remy had one simple plan. Take his pay, find the closest late bus, and go back to his tiny rented room with its peeling walls and familiar stack of unpaid bills. His body felt wrung out, his shoulders sore from hours in the recliner. All he wanted was a shower hot enough to sting in a bed, even if that bed was little more than a mattress pushed against a cold wall. He was halfway through untying the strings of his scrub top in the locker room when the door opened. The clinic coordinator stood there, straight-backed, holding a folder against his chest as if it were part of his uniform. His eyes were the precise mix of professional politeness and cool calculation that private medicine seemed to breed. "Remy, a moment, please." It was not a question. Remy pulled the scrub top back into place and followed him through the corridor. The crying he had listened to all night was gone now, replaced by the distant hum of machines and the murmur of morning staff arriving. The absence of that sound was almost dizzying. They entered a small conference room with frosted glass walls and a too-large table. Waiting there, in one of the chairs, was the Alpha from the night. Without the harsh light of monitors and the constant backdrop of his son's screams, Gabriel looked different. Still composed, still very much an alpha who belonged in boardrooms and on magazine covers, but his posture had the slight collapse of someone who had been awake for far too many nights in a row. His shirt was clean, his watch expensive, but there were faint shadows under his eyes and a tightness at the corners of his mouth that no amount of money could smooth away. The coordinator took the seat opposite Remy and opened the folder, the gesture practiced, almost ceremonial. He began with numbers. Longer sleep intervals recorded during the night, more stable heart rate, fewer episodes of uncontrolled crying. He spoke in the clipped, neutral language of charts and graphs, sliding printouts across the table so that Gabriel and Remy could see the evidence of what they had already felt in their bones. For the first time since the baby's birth, something had shifted. "Your intervention correlated with the only sustained improvement we have seen," the coordinator said, his tone matter of fact. It was not praise, but it could not hide the thin thread of hope underneath. Remy looked at the papers, though he did not need them. He remembered every second of that night, the way the baby's body had slowly softened against him, the way the screams had collapsed into exhausted hiccups. Numbers were just a translation of what his arms already knew. Gabriel watched him more than the charts. There was a new quality in his gaze, something sharper than simple curiosity. It was the look of a man who had finally found a lever that might move an immovable wall and was terrified of losing it. The proposal came next, delivered by the coordinator with the same smooth clarity he might use to describe a treatment plan. Gabriel's household needed someone who could care for the child not just occasionally but continuously. A stable presence. A specialist who understood his particular needs. The offer was laid out piece by piece, a private room in the Alpha's house, not a corner of a staff dormitory, but separate living quarters. A salary that sounded almost unreal to someone who had been stitching night shifts together just to cover hormone medication and rent. Access to the same level of medical support as the child. A schedule that, while demanding, would at least be predictable. No more racing across the city between multiple jobs. On the surface, it was a dream contract, but the coordinator did not stop at logistics. He spoke more carefully when he mentioned what the doctors had only begun to hint at, that sometimes, when an Omega had been pregnant before, the body retained a latent capacity for lactation, that under the right conditions, with the right hormonal signals in sufficient contact, milk could return or increase. He did not say the word wet nurse, but the concept hung in the air. "Given how strongly the child responded to your physical contact," he said, choosing every syllable with precision, "it is possible that direct breastfeeding might provide an additional regulatory effect. It is, of course, a sensitive matter, but medically speaking, it could be the missing piece." The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Remy felt his throat constrict. He had heard stories like this before, far from places like this clinic. In cramped apartments behind cheap supermarkets, in overcrowded neighborhoods where money rarely reached, Omegas whose own milk had outlasted their babies, feeding neighbors' infants whose mothers had none. It had always been something spoken of in half-whispers, wrapped in layers of shame and necessity. Feed, but do not talk about it. Help, but do not be seen. Now, the same idea was being laid out in a bright, sterile conference room, attached to the name of a powerful alpha and a contract on expensive paper. His mind split along familiar fault lines. One part recoiled. Fear rose fast and sharp, fear of becoming nothing more than a body rented by the hour, used until it was no longer needed, and then discarded. Fear of forming a bond deeper than professionalism with a child that was not his, only to be told one day to step back and disappear. Fear of waking up in that same hospital years later, with another kind of loss that no one would dignify with grief. Another part, quieter but relentless, counted reality. His current life was already a chain of compromises. Cheap pills that kept his hormones from spinning out of control, their side effects leaving him drained. Long walks between bus stops because taxis were a luxury. Working through the night and then pretending it did not cost him anything. For the first time in a long while, there was an opening that did not look like bare survival. Here, in this uncomfortable conversation, was the possibility that his skills and even his damaged body could be more than a stopgap measure, that they could change the course of one small, frightened life. Gabriel spoke then, not hiding behind the coordinator's polished phrases. His voice was lower than during the night when he had snapped instructions at nurses and doctors. "I will make sure the contract is clean," he said. "No hidden clauses, no traps. If you agree, you do it knowing exactly what you're stepping into. And if later you choose to leave, you will not leave with nothing." It was as close as an alpha like him could come to saying, "I need you." Remy met his eyes and saw not just power there, but something he recognized far too well. The hollow, desperate stare of someone who had been listening to his child scream for too many nights in a row. It was unnerving to realize that this man, who looked as if he owned half the city, was in some way as lost as any parent he had ever helped. The idea of moving into that house, of letting his body become part of its daily rhythm, pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. He imagined corridors that smelled of polished wood and money, staff that would watch him with either suspicion or thinly veiled curiosity. He imagined carrying the baby through unfamiliar rooms, his own scent spread through spaces that had never been meant for him. He also imagined returning to his rented room as if nothing had changed, to the thin blanket, to the noise of neighbors through the walls, to the knowledge that somewhere, in a house on a hill, a baby who had finally stopped screaming in his arms would start again in someone else's. "I need time to think," he said eventually. The words came out more hoarse than he intended. The coordinator inclined his head, already sliding papers back into the folder. Gabriel did not protest. He simply watched Remy stand up, shoulders tense, the lines of his scrubs hanging looser than they should on his frame. On the way home, the city blurred around him. Buses, stations, gray pavements. His body moved on autopilot, guided by routes it knew too well. But his mind stayed in that conference room, and in that nursery, and in that single chair where Dawn had found him with a child pressed to his chest. That night, when he finally lay down on his narrow bed, he closed his eyes, and the silence of his room rang louder than any noise. In that silence, he heard again the baby's cry breaking apart, softening into sleep only when held against his body. He felt again the heavy warmth of that small weight, the way the frantic heartbeat had slowly matched his own. It hit him then with painful clarity. Saying no would not just be refusing a job, it would be refusing the part of himself that still believed he was meant to be more than a pair of tired hands moving from one temporary crib to another. By the time morning light seeped through the thin curtain, the answer inside him had already formed. He could still be afraid. He could still doubt. But walking away from this would be an abandonment he would never quite forgive himself for. The move into Gabriel's house happened faster than Remy had time to process. One day he was stepping over the uneven threshold of his rented room. The next he was walking across marble tiles that did not echo under his feet. Staff carried his small suitcase in a cardboard box with his folded clothes as if they were priceless, though he knew every item could have fit into a single worn backpack. They showed him his room first. It was in a separate wing, technically part of the staff quarters, but more generous than any place he had lived in years. A bed wide enough for two people he did not have, a wardrobe that looked half empty even after he put his things inside, a small bathroom with a shower that did not flicker or leak. The window looked out over the garden, not the back of another building. Then they walked him through the routine, meal times, the times when doctors would visit to check the baby, the schedule for cleaning staff, which doors required codes, which remained open. It all sounded ordered, structured, like someone had tried to turn chaos into a spreadsheet. The nursery was the opposite of his old room in every way. Light, wide, full of silent technology. An intelligent crib that adjusted height and movement, sensors built into the mattress, monitors tracking breath and pulse, a camera perched in the corner feeding a live image to a sleek screen. Shelves lined with bottles of different shapes and colors, careful rows of sterilized nipples and pacifiers, machines to warm and cool and sanitize. All of it had failed. The baby had a name now that Remy heard for the first time from Gabriel's mouth. Milo. It settled strangely in his ears, like a word that might be soft someday, but for now was tangled up with tension. At the beginning, Remy did what he always did. He used every technique he trusted. He held Milo skin to skin when he could, resting the small, burning body against his own chest so the child could hear a steady heartbeat. He shifted positions, changed angles, carried the baby upright on his side, curled along his forearm. He dimmed the lights, closed heavy curtains, asked staff to lower their voices in the corridor. Sometimes it worked for a few minutes. The screams would lose some of their sharpness. Milo would slip into a thin, restless sleep, and then a sound or a change in smell would rip it all open again. Nights shattered into fragments, 10 minutes of quiet, 30 minutes of pacing, an hour of Milo's throat fighting against itself. Remy slept in pieces, curled on the narrow sofa in the nursery or not at all, afraid that if he left for too long, something essential would break. Meanwhile, his own body took note of the new reality. The constant crying, the proximity, the touch of tiny hands clutching at his shirt triggered reflexes buried deep in his physiology. His chest ached with a dull, almost bruised pain. The skin around his nipples grew sensitive, reacting to Milo's mouth searching through the fabric, even when there was nothing for him to find. Sometimes, in the middle of changing a diaper or adjusting a blanket, Remy would feel a faint dampness under his shirt. It startled him, sent a flush of heat through his chest and throat. The first time he ducked into the bathroom, peeled off the fabric, and stared at the small, translucent marks on the cotton, his stomach turned. "Not again," he whispered to the empty room. But his body did not care what he wanted. It responded to the signals it received, the smell of a baby, the sound of his particular cries, the weight of him pressed close. Hormones moved along old, familiar pathways, ignoring the years that had been supposed to close them off. The night when everything changed did not announce itself as special. The house was quiet, wrapped in that particular stillness that comes when even the staff finally sleep. Only the dim nightlight in the nursery burned, casting a gentle circle of yellow across the crib and the armchair beside it. Milo had been crying for hours, not the sharp, furious cry of early days, but a hoarse, exhausted wail that broke and reformed, rising whenever his fear spiked. Remy had walked and rocked and hummed until the muscles in his back burned. Now he sat in the armchair, the baby pressed against his bare chest. He had taken off his shirt when he realized the fabric was only making them both sweat and itch. Skin to skin helped, the pediatrician had said, so he offered skin. His hands trembled from fatigue. His eyelids felt like they had sand pressed under them. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the way it does when the body is desperate to sleep and is denied the chance. Milo's face was blotchy, his eyes squeezed shut, his mouth pulling wide for another scream that sounded more like a rasp. At some point, the crying changed. It frayed at the edges, dissolved into rough breaths that did not quite catch. Milo's head stopped flinging backward, stopped twisting away from Remy's chest. Instead, he began to nuzzle downward, pushing his cheek against Remy's skin, then his nose, then opening his mouth and searching blindly. It was an instinct older than all of them, rooting, seeking warmth and milk and the kind of safety that only came from a particular kind of closeness. Remy's entire body went rigid. Every fear he had been keeping carefully caged rushed forward at once. He knew, better than anyone, what this meant. He knew what would happen if he allowed that instinct to complete itself. The line between caregiver and something deeper would be crossed in one simple, irreversible act. His heart hammered against Milo's ear. He could feel his own breath catching, the tremor in his fingers as he tried to hold the baby in place without guiding him. No, he thought desperately, even as another part of him whispered, he is asking. Milo's lips grazed over sensitive skin, smeared with tears and saliva. He let out a frustrated whimper, a sound that cut straight through Remy's chest. His hands flexed weakly, small fingers scraping at Remy's ribs. He was no longer just crying from habit. He was straining toward a need his body knew how to name, even if no one else dared to. This was the intersection he had dreaded. On one side, his terror of being used, of loving too much, of losing again. On the other, a baby whose breathing was beginning to stutter from the effort of screaming, whose lips were pale around the edges. If he pulled back now, if he kept that last barrier up, he could tell himself later that he had stayed professional. He could tell himself that it was not his responsibility, that he was only there to soothe within acceptable limits. The doctors would find another solution, or they would not, and Milo would grow up with a nervous system that remembered these nights as a kind of war. If he did not pull back, there would be no pretending, no going back to being just a hired pair of hands. The decision never formed as a clear sentence in his mind. It happened in his body first. Something in him loosened, stopped resisting the pull of gravity. He shifted his grip just enough that Milo's searching mouth slid lower to where the skin was darker, more tender. For a moment, everything was clumsy. Milo's mouth slipped, his head bobbed, a small, angry sound tore out of him. Remy almost panicked and pulled him away. Then, the baby adjusted, lips closing in a seal that was far too familiar to Remy's nerves. The world narrowed to a single point. Milo sucked once, twice, and then more strongly, his fists tightening reflexively against Remy's chest. Remy felt an answering pull deep inside his body, a slow, painful release. Liquid that had no outlet for years now found a path. Breathing quickened in both of them, then began to synchronize. The rasp of Milo's exhausted sobs smoothed out into broken gulps, then into more even swallows. His shoulders, which had been locked in tension, dropped. The lines in his forehead eased. The crying stopped. Silence flooded the nursery with shocking force. It was not the brittle silence of held breath, but a heavy, peaceful kind. Remy could hear the hum of the air system, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, his own pulse pounding in his ears. "Breathe," he whispered, not sure whether he was speaking to Milo or himself. The baby latched, drank, and then, as the edge of panic receded, his sucking slowed. His eyelids fluttered, opened halfway, then closed again. His fingers, still curled against Remy's skin, relaxed one by one. The hard, frantic body that had fought the world for so many nights melted into the curve of Remy's arm. In the corridor, footsteps approached. Gabriel, drawn out of his room by the familiar pattern of escalating cries, had been on his way to the nursery. He expected to hear that same storm he'd been walking into over and over. Instead, halfway down the hallway, he heard nothing. The absence of sound jolted him more than any scream. He pushed the nursery door open a fraction and stopped. The scene before him was so quiet that it felt almost forbidden to witness. Remy slumped in the armchair, bare-chested, his head tipped back against the cushion, eyes half closed from exhaustion. Milo pressed against him, mouth latched at Remy's breast, one small hand splayed across the Omega's ribs, his whole body broadcasting a single message: safe. Remy did not see him. His gaze was fixed downward on the baby, his expression a raw mix of fear, relief, and something that looked dangerously like tenderness. Inside Gabriel, two versions of himself collided. The rational one began calculating instantly. If anyone saw this, if his family found out, if a single photo ever leaked, the fallout would be enormous. Questions about boundaries, morality, tradition. Board members frowning, relatives whispering, partners wondering whether he had finally lost his mind. But below that, in a place he could not dress in business language, another truth burned brighter. For the first time in his son's short life, Milo did not look like a clenched fist. He looked like a child who had eaten, who had found what he had been searching for since the day he was forced out of the safety of a womb. The contrast was so stark that it left no room for debate. Gabriel stepped back from the doorway without making a sound. He did not interrupt. He did not clear his throat or demand an explanation or start a conversation about limits and roles. He let the door close softly again, keeping that fragile universe intact. Later, lying in his own bed and listening to a house that, for the first time since Milo's birth, was wrapped in deep, undisturbed silence. He stared into the dark and understood that this night had split his life into before and after. Before, he had believed there were lines he would never cross to protect his image. After, he knew that he would cross any of them to preserve the sight of his son sleeping peacefully in another man's arms. After that night, the house changed shape without anyone moving a single wall. Officially, nothing was added to Remy's contract. No clause about breastfeeding was written, no signatures were updated. On paper, he remained a live-in nanny, responsible for care, soothing, and night duty. In reality, everything began to orbit his chest. The day no longer followed only Gabriel's calendar of meetings and calls, or the staff's cleaning schedules. It bent around feeding times. The hours when Remy disappeared into the nursery and closed the door became the new fixed points. The cook learned not to knock then. The cleaning crew adjusted vacuuming to avoid the hallway outside the baby's room. Even the security staff on the cameras unconsciously tracked patterns of light in that part of the house, knowing that if the nursery lamp was on at certain times, the rest of the building would be quiet. Milo responded first and most clearly. His weight began to climb, not in erratic jumps but in a smooth, confident line. The pediatrician, who had learned to choose his words carefully with Gabriel, allowed himself the smallest smile when he read out the measurements. Sleep logs showed longer stretches of rest. Most telling of all, his crying changed. It was no longer an endless, indistinguishable siren. It had become something almost ordinary. A short, hungry cry before a feeding, a grumpy complaint when he was tired, a sharp, offended wail when a cold wipe touched his skin. Signals, not alarms. For Remy, the transformation was both miracle and weight. His body became not just a tool, but the primary regulator of another human being's nervous system. His days blurred into a cycle of feeding, burping, comforting, and snatching sleep where he could. His chest ached more often than not, sometimes heavy, sometimes painfully emptied, his skin marked by small, desperate hands in the pull of Milo's mouth. Inside the house, reactions formed in layers. Some staff members watched him with a quiet, growing respect. They were the ones who came from families where colicky babies had worn the adults down to raw nerves, the ones who remembered mothers or grandparents walking the floors at night. They saw how Remy stood between Milo and that abyss, how he still got up when his legs shook and his eyes burned. In the staff kitchen, they lowered their voices when his name came up, not out of secrecy, but out of a kind of reverence. Others looked at him with something sharper. A young housemaid, used to hierarchy where alphas held the center and everyone else revolved discreetly around them, muttered that the Omega was becoming too central to the baby. In whispered conversations over coffee, they wondered how long Gabriel would tolerate such dependence, whether this was a temporary measure or the beginning of some unspoken scandal. One of the older housekeepers, who had grown up in a conservative household where roles were rigid and visible, watched Remy with open disapproval. In her eyes there were invisible lines that should not be crossed, even for the sake of a child. An Omega nursing the heir of the family did not fit anywhere in her understanding of order. When she passed him in the hallway, carrying Milo against his shoulder, her mouth tightened, as if she could smell a rule burning. Gabriel pretended at first that he occupied the outer ring of this new system. He buried himself in the parts he knew how to handle. He walked through the house with a tablet in hand, recording feeding times, sleep durations, weight gains. He scheduled extra checkups, ordered new bottles and formulas, just in case, updated spreadsheets that no one but him and the pediatrician ever looked at. But numbers could not keep his eyes away from reality. He would push open the nursery door under the pretext of checking on them and find the same scene in endless variations. Milo draped across Remy's chest, one small hand gripping the fabric of his t-shirt, as if to make sure he would not vanish. Or Milo half asleep, mouth slack after feeding, cheek pressed against warm skin, breathing so deep it seemed impossible this was the same child who had once fought every second of existence. In those moments, something in Gabriel twisted. It was not simple jealousy of Remy as a person. It was something more primitive. His son's first, most profound sense of "I am safe" was not tied to his scent, his voice, his arms. It was tied to another adult, to an Omega whose body had done what his never could. That feeling did not always come out cleanly. Sometimes it hardened his tone. He would stand at the foot of the crib with the tablet and ask in a voice that sounded eerily like a board meeting, how many milliliters did he take this time? He would demand that Remy keep a detailed log of which side, how long, how often, as if data could give him back a share of control. He would suggest trying to alternate more with bottles, frame it as preparation for the future. At other times, the hardness dissolved, leaving only quiet. He would slip into the nursery and not say anything at all. Just sit in the chair by the window while Remy, eyes heavy, held Milo against his chest. He watched the slow rise and fall of their breathing, the way their bodies had learned each other's rhythms. In those silent intervals, the house felt balanced on a knife's edge between sanctuary and exposure. Inside the nursery, they were a closed system, an alpha, an omega, and a baby who had finally stopped screaming. Outside, a world of expectations waited, full of people who would have opinions about what was happening here without ever having heard that first desperate cry. Remy was not blind to any of it. He felt the respect and the suspicion in equal measure. He saw the way some staff avoided meeting his eyes, as if acknowledging him meant acknowledging the taboo they all silently stepped around. He noticed how quickly conversations died when he entered the kitchen for a glass of water. He also felt, in every interaction with Gabriel, the tension that had nothing to do with salaries or schedules. His body, which had been turned into a lifeline, had also become a mirror, reflecting back an echo of the Alpha's perceived failure. Each time Milo calmed faster in his arms than in Gabriel's, guilt and relief coiled together between them. Remy tried to make himself smaller. He dressed in looser shirts, pulled them down quickly after feedings, avoided sitting in the nursery when he knew others might walk past. When Gabriel was nearby, he turned his body slightly away, instinctively shielding the sight of skin, of closeness, as if the intimacy of what he and Milo shared needed to be hidden even from the father it served. Yet in the deep hours of the night, when the house peeled away its layers of formality, honesty crept in. One morning, just before dawn, Milo woke with a thin, broken cry that Remy recognized as the beginning of a spiral. His own muscles protested as he pushed himself upright. Every joint felt heavy, his vision blurred for a second when he stood. Still, he went to the crib, lifted the child, and settled back into the armchair, movements slower than usual. He did not hear Gabriel's footsteps at first. The door opened softly, and the Alpha appeared in the frame, hair mussed, eyes still fogged with sleep, drawn by the sound like every other night. "I can take him," Gabriel said quietly, "so you can get some water." Remy's first instinct was to refuse. No one had taken the baby from his arms during a feeding since the first tentative days. This was his responsibility, his role. His body had become so interwoven with Milo's safety that the idea of handing him over mid-storm triggered a flash of panic, but his hands were shaking more than usual. His mouth was dry. The room seemed to tilt just a little in that dangerous way that meant he had pushed past his limits too many nights in a row. He exhaled and nodded once. Carefully, he shifted Milo, guiding the baby from his chest to Gabriel's waiting arms. Their fingers brushed as the small body passed between them. It was a brief, almost accidental touch, but there was nothing casual in what moved between them in that fraction of a second. Gratitude, raw and awkward. Guilt they both carried for different reasons, bone-deep exhaustion, and beneath it all, an unspoken terror that if they misstepped, if any of this collapsed, the small life they held between them would be the one to pay the price. Remy stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on his face, leaning on the sink until the world steadied. When he returned, Milo was still restless in Gabriel's arms, small fists twisting in his shirt. The baby's eyes flicked past the Alpha's collarbone, searching. The moment Remy stepped closer, Milo reached out, an instinctive, almost desperate grab in his direction. Gabriel saw it. So did Remy. The tension thickened, heavy and undeniable. Without a word, Gabriel handed the child back. This time their hands met fully, palm to palm, for a second longer than necessary. The contact was warm, solid, and so charged with everything unsaid that it made both of them draw a slightly sharper breath. For them, That night marked a shift as clear as the one in Gabriel's bedroom after the first forbidden feeding. They could no longer pretend they were simply employer and employee. There was a three-point system now: the alpha, the omega, and the child who tied them together. Outside their orbit, the house continued to function, meals prepared, floors cleaned, appointments kept. But in the quiet spaces, in glances passed across doorways, and in conversations that cut off when footsteps approached, the tension kept growing. The villa stood balanced between two realities. Inside the nursery, there was a fragile, hard-won peace built on Remy's body and Gabriel's reluctant surrender to what worked. Beyond its walls, family expectations and social codes waited like a gathering storm cloud. For the moment, the silence held. So did the secret. But the house itself felt as if it knew that this kind of quiet could not last forever. It was impossible for something that unusual to stay contained within the villa walls. At first, it slipped out in the smallest, most predictable way, through a careless mouth in a family conversation that was supposed to be harmless. One of the younger maids, exhausted after a long week of broken nights, visited a distant aunt on her day off. Over tea, she complained about her schedule, about a baby who had screamed without pause until that Omega nanny moved in. The aunt, fishing for details, asked what exactly the Omega did that others had not. The maid, feeling both tired and proud of the strange household she served, let it slip with a nervous laugh that the child only really settles at the Omega's breast. The aunt, who loved stories almost as much as she loved outrage, retold it the next day. In her version, the detail had already grown sharper. It was no longer an exhausted confession, but a small scandal. By the time it passed through two more relatives, the phrase had turned into a whispered legend. In the house of the heir to a major corporation, an Omega nanny was nursing the successor as if he were her own. News, dressed as concern, traveled quickly. The family council, which usually confined its interest to profit margins, acquisitions, and expansion plans, suddenly found itself circling a different topic. They framed it as personal but strategically significant, as if Gabriel's private life were just another line on a balance sheet that could threaten or strengthen the family brand. A meeting was called in the large living room, usually reserved for discussions about investments. Heavy curtains were half drawn, muting the light. Portraits of ancestors watched from the walls, solemn and judgmental by default. On the coffee table lay not market reports, but printed pages with a few short notes about domestic arrangements and current childcare practices. Gabriel sat at one end of the long sofa, shoulders squared by habit, jaw tight in a way that betrayed the tension he tried to hide. Around him, relatives arranged themselves in loose ranks. An older uncle, always the loudest in matters of reputation, cleared his throat and talked about undermined authority. A neatly dressed aunt, whose own children had been raised by a small army of discreet professionals, murmured about impropriety and lines one simply does not cross. On a tablet propped on the low table, one of the company's key partners joined by video link. His tone was smoother, wrapped in corporate diplomacy, but the message was the same. In certain conservative markets, he pointed out with a careful smile, rumors like these could be difficult to contain. Investors liked stability. They liked predictability. They did not like the phrase that had already started to appear in whispers, the strange upbringing of one very powerful alpha's son. Proposed solutions began to surface, all of them similar in their bones. The child, they said, should be weaned from the Omega's breast as soon as possible. There were formulas, there were certified specialists, there were methods. A properly trained nanny from the right background could be hired, someone whose presence would not raise questions. Remy was described without malice, but without humanity either, as a temporary measure that had overstayed its usefulness, an asset, a tool, a technical resource, easy to remove and compensate. Someone suggested, almost cheerfully, that finding a suitable public partner for Gabriel would solve several issues at once. A union that looked good in photographs, a spouse who could stand by his side at events and pose with the child for lifestyle magazines. The existence of an Omega nursing the baby would fade into the background then, rewritten as an early regrettable experiment. Parallel to this, Beyond the carefully curated circle of family and partners, the media began to stir. A journalist who had been hovering around Gabriel's world for years, always hoping for a misstep worth printing, received a discreet hint from a dissatisfied cousin. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be traced. Just a few suggestive phrases about unusual childcare and an omega with too much influence. He started to dig. Quietly at first, a question to a clinic receptionist here, a drink bought for a lower-level employee there. No article appeared in print yet, but the idea itself began to move through certain circles. At late dinners and behind private social media accounts, people started using a new expression, half amused, half scandalized. That strange way the heir is raising his son. Gabriel felt the pressure long before anyone put it into words for him. To his advisors, the path seemed obvious. Sacrifice the omega, sacrifice the unconventional practice, save the image. This was how problems were solved in their world. Identify the variable that did not fit and remove it. They spoke about it as if they were recommending a simple restructuring. End the breastfeeding. Let Remy go with a generous severance. Hire someone safer. Align your life with expectations and move on. Inside Gabriel, everything resisted. Every time he tried to imagine calling Remy into his office and telling him to stop, he saw Milo's face. Not the face from the first weeks, twisted and red with constant screaming, but the one he had now when he fell asleep after feeding. Heavy, relaxed, one small hand unconsciously curved into the fabric of Remy's shirt. He remembered nights in the hospital, the absolute terror of not being able to soothe his own child, and the first time he had seen that terror quieted in another man's arms. Remy did not know all the details of the council's debates, but he did not have to. He felt the shift in the air of the house. Conversations fell silent more quickly when he entered a room. Staff who had once spoken to him with easy familiarity now watched their words. He noticed the way Gabriel returned from family meetings tighter, colder, his answers shorter, his eyes distant as if they were tracking invisible calculations no one else could see. One afternoon, on his way past the half-open door of the study, Remy heard his own name. He stopped instinctively, before he could remind himself that listening was dangerous. A voice, one of Gabriel's uncles, laughed without warmth and said something like, "You can always buy his silence later. Omegas like that do not refuse money." The phrase hit like a physical blow. It cracked open the old, poorly healed places inside him. He remembered another living room, another group of relatives speaking as if he were not in the next room. The day his own family decided that it was easier to cut him off than to accept his choices, the way they had spoken of him as if he were a problem to be solved. In his mind, he began to pack. He pictured folding his clothes back into the small suitcase, stripping his presence from the room that had briefly felt like something close to home. He mapped routes back to the cheap part of the city, checked bus lines in his head, calculated how long his savings would last if he walked away. But then he would look down and see Milo sprawled across his chest, breath soft, releasing a tiny sigh of relief he had not even known he was holding. Every time the baby's fingers curled around the fabric near his heart and relaxed only when they found skin underneath, Remy's resolve to preemptively run dissolved. The family council did not care about these moments. In the end, they formalized their position and shaped it into an ultimatum, cloaked in the language of concern. They called another meeting, this time smaller, more pointed. Gabriel sat through a flood of phrases about stability and tradition and the future of the corporation. Behind each of those polite words lay the same demand. He was to end this story. He was to bring his private life into a shape the family and key partners considered acceptable. That meant a child who no longer depended on an Omega's body for calm. That meant a household that looked like the ones in their own photographs. That meant Remy and everything he represented taken out of the equation in a controlled, compensated way. If he did not comply within what they termed a reasonable time frame, there would be consequences. They did not shout. They did not threaten openly. They spoke of investors losing confidence, of relatives quietly shifting their support to another potential public face for the company, of the risk that, when the time came to choose who would stand at the head of everything the family had built, the spotlight might turn elsewhere. Stripped of smooth phrases, the choice they offered was brutally simple. On one side, a child whose entire sense of safety was still physically tied to an Omega's heartbeat and warmth. On the other, a life arranged to look right from the outside, curated carefully for other people's eyes. For the first time, Gabriel was forced to acknowledge that he could not keep both. Under the pressure of the council, Gabriel agreed to do what they demanded, even though every inner signal in him called it a mistake. He did not admit that out loud. Instead, he asked for the one thing that still gave him some sense of control: a plan. The pediatrician he trusted came to the house with a calm face and a folder of recommendations. In the nursery, among soft toys and quiet machines, he laid out a strategy that sounded gentle on paper. They would not cut anything abruptly. First, one feeding at the breast would be replaced with a bottle, then another. Remy would still hold Milo close, skin to skin if needed, so that the child did not lose the sense of warmth and safety. Over a span of weeks, the body would adapt, milk would gradually diminish, and Milo would learn to take nutrition from other sources while keeping other forms of touch. On the printed pages, it all read reasonable, almost humane. When Gabriel informed Remy, the air between them thickened. They met in Gabriel's study, a room of dark wood and muted light. Gabriel's words were precise, almost clinical, as he repeated the doctor's recommendations. Remy listened with his head slightly bowed, eyes on the edge of the desk rather than on Gabriel's face. His fingers curled around the wood so tightly that his knuckles blanched. He understood the medical logic. He understood the external pressure without needing to hear the names. But beneath the explanations, beneath phrases like gradual transition and long-term adjustment, he heard another meaning. For him, this was not a technical change in feeding. It was the beginning of his own erasure from the core of Milo's life. "Of course," he said softly when Gabriel finished, "if it is what you want, we will follow the plan." The words were correct. The tone was empty. The first attempts at weaning felt like a war disguised as routine. Milo noticed the change immediately. The bottle that had sometimes been accepted without a fight after nursing now became a symbol of loss. When Remy brought it to his lips instead of offering his chest, the baby's entire body stiffened. He turned his head, pushed the silicone nipple away with surprising force for his size, his face screwing up as if in confusion and then outrage. The crying returned, not in the same chaotic flood as in the beginning, but in sharp, cutting waves. It held a new note now, something like betrayal. Milo rooted frantically against Remy's shirt, seeking the warmth and taste he knew, and when he did not find it, his cry broke into hoarse, breathless protests. Remy followed the plan as best he could. He held Milo close, even with the bottle, pressing the child's cheek against his bare skin, trying to tell his body, "I am still here, even if this has changed." He kept his voice steady, murmuring nonsense sounds, swallowing his own panic. His chest did not understand moderation. Milk came according to the old rhythm, filling, heavy, aching. When he withheld the breast at the prescribed times, a throbbing pain built under his ribs, a physical echo of the emotional strain. His skin felt too tight. At night, alone in his room after finally managing to put Milo down, he gritted his teeth under the hot spray of the shower as his body tried and failed to readjust. Hormones linked to lactation clashed with the chemistry of stress, flooding him with headaches, nausea, flashes of irrational anger that he turned inward. Every discarded drop, every painful hour of fullness without relief, woke the memory of a hospital bed and a child he had not been allowed to hold. Gabriel watched the process from a vantage point that felt like punishment. There were moments when part of him was almost relieved. On the rare occasions when Milo took a bottle without shrieking, when he sucked mechanically and then drifted off in Remy's arms, Gabriel felt a small, guilty spark of hope. If this worked, if the child could be fed without the Omega's body at the center of everything, the pressure around them, all might ease. Then there were the other times, the more frequent ones, the times when Milo's face crumpled at the first sign of the bottle, when his eyes flooded with tears before the first refusal. The times when he screamed so hard that the veins stood out in his neck, when he arched away from the plastic and toward Remy with a kind of desperate certainty that made it impossible to pretend he did not understand what was being taken from him. In those moments, Gabriel felt as though they were using the word normalization to dress up something cruel. Cracks began to appear between the adults, as inevitable as fissures in overstrained glass. Remy pulled himself back behind a professional mask, piece by piece. He did his tasks with the same care, but the warmth in his gestures started to move underground, reserved only for Milo. With Gabriel, his interactions grew narrower. He avoided eye contact, answered questions briefly, giving factual reports about feeding volumes and nap lengths in a tone that might have belonged in the pediatrician's office. Gabriel oscillated without finding balance. Some days he withdrew, burying himself deeper in work to avoid the sight of Milo sobbing in Remy's arms. Other days he overcompensated, demanding detailed feedback, asking Remy to adjust schedules, questioning tiny variations as if control over the data could erase the wrongness he felt. Neither of them spoke aloud the word that hung between them: harm. The night it all broke loose came after a day of particularly strict adherence to the plan. Several breastfeedings had been replaced. Milo had resisted more fiercely each time, his protests escalating until he finally exhausted himself into short, restless sleeps that did not look like real rest. After midnight, he woke with a sound that was not a simple cry. It was a raw, tearing wail that seemed to shred what progress they had made. Remy rushed to the crib and lifted him, murmuring automatically, trying first what the plan demanded, holding, rocking, offering a bottle while keeping him pressed close. Milo rejected it outright. He thrashed in Remy's arms, cheeks wet, fists beating weakly at his chest as if trying to break through his restraint. His breathing grew fast and shallow, every inhale catching, every exhale half choked by sobs. His skin grew hot and slick with sweat. Minutes stretched. Remy tried all the tricks he knew, all the ones that had once worked even in the worst nights. Nothing cut through the child's panic. The sound tunneled through the house, dragging Gabriel out of a light, uneasy sleep. He entered the nursery to find Remy standing with Milo clamped to his shoulder, the Omega's own face pale and tight. The baby's cries had lost their shape. They sounded like something breaking. Between waves of screaming, Milo seemed to gulp for air, his small body shuddering, his chest working too hard. For a few terrifying seconds at a time, his breathing stuttered, as if his system simply forgot how to coordinate all the moving parts. The pediatrician arrived faster than should have been possible, pulled out of his own bed by the urgency in Gabriel's voice over the phone. His professional calm cracked when he saw the state of the child. He checked vital signs, listened to Milo's chest, watched his attempts to catch breath between sobs. His voice, when he finally spoke, held a note that had never been there before. Real alarm. He talked about overloading a nervous system that had already spent its earliest weeks in a state of near-constant stress, about the risk of pushing a fragile regulatory pattern past its limits, about exhaustion, not just in the muscles, but in the child's ability to cope with the world at all. He did not use the language of counsels or reputations. He used the language of immediate harm. "Stop," he said simply. "You need to stop this for now. Go back to what works. We can think about the long term later. Right now, his system is telling you that this is too much." Remy did not wait for permission. At the first nod, at the first crack in the plan's authority, he shifted Milo, bringing him to his chest with a familiarity that hurt. The baby latched almost blindly, as if he had been waiting for a door to reopen. The effect was not instant, but it was unmistakable. The scream faltered. The rhythm of breathing evened out, from ragged gasps to shorter, steadier pulls. The iron tension in Milo's spine softened by degrees. His fists, still trembling, relaxed fraction by fraction against Remy's skin. Tears kept coming, but they changed quality, from frantic to exhausted. The adults watched in silence, as the very thing they had tried to remove became, once again, the only thing that brought the child back from the edge. The damage had already been done, not only to Milo's frayed nervous system, but to the trust between the people who were supposed to protect him. Remy felt as if they had forced him to go against his own instincts, against the wordless understanding his body had with the child, just to satisfy someone else's picture of how things should look. The knowledge that he had participated in this, even under pressure, scraped at him like sandpaper. Gabriel, for his part, could not shake the sense that he had betrayed his son twice over, first by agreeing to the plan that hurt him, and then by hesitating before admitting it was wrong. He could still hear Milo's desperate gasps in his head when he closed his eyes, could still see the way the child had clawed at the air as if trying to find an exit. Between them hung a silence neither knew how to cross. They went through the motions in the days that followed. Remy fed and soothed and carried. Gabriel worked, signed documents, took calls, made decisions. But under every necessary exchange, there was a question with no answer yet. If they could so easily be pushed into acting against the child's needs once, what would stop it from happening again? The crisis came when they had almost convinced themselves the worst was behind them. After the failed weaning attempt, they had retreated, gone back to the breast more often, tried to soothe the child's shaken system. Days blurred into a careful, fragile routine of partial feedings, extra naps, and hypervigilance. On the surface, Milo seemed to stabilize. He smiled more, laughed in short, surprised bursts, clung to Remy with a familiar, hungry trust. The adults let themselves breathe a little, not fully, just enough to believe that maybe slowly they were climbing out of the pit they had dug. Then the virus hit. It was nothing remarkable on paper. A seasonal infection, the kind that slid unnoticed through staff households and public transport. A cough here, a low fever there. Someone on the cleaning team must have brought it in, carrying it on their clothes before they even knew they were sick. For Milo, already stretched thin by weeks of stress, it landed like a blow. The fever rose fast with no polite warning. 1 hour he was merely warm and clingy. The next his skin felt like it was radiating heat. Remy noticed first when he picked him up and flinched at the contact. Milo's eyes, usually bright and curious even when he complained, turned glassy. His gaze slid past faces without fully focusing. The crying changed, then stopped. It was that silence that truly terrified Remy. Milo's voice, so often a constant background to their days and nights, faded into a weak, intermittent whimper and then fell away altogether. His body felt heavy in Remy's arms, not the comfortable weight of sleep, but the surrendering heaviness of someone too tired to protest. Gabriel called the pediatrician with a tone that allowed no delay. When the doctor arrived and saw the numbers on the thermometer, the rapid breathing, the way Milo's limbs hung limp, his expression hardened. There was no discussion about home care. He ordered immediate hospitalization. The night swallowed them as they drove. Hospital lights rose out of the darkness, harsh and indifferent. The smell of antiseptic in the admitting area hit Remy's senses like a memory he had tried for years to bury. That other night, that other child, the moment when monitors had tracked the fading of a heartbeat instead of a fever, they moved quickly. Nurses set up an IV line in Milo's tiny hand, taped it with practiced gentleness. Cool liquid flowed into his overheated body. A nurse pushed antipyretics through the line, another adjusted oxygen, a third clipped sensors to measure saturation and heart rhythm. Machines began to draw lines and numbers that attempted to translate this small crisis into data. For Gabriel, it was like stepping back into a nightmare he thought he had left at the threshold of the clinic months ago. Flickering screens, medical jargon, the feeling of being a powerful man rendered useless by his inability to change a single number on a monitor. Only this time, the child on the bed was not an abstract outcome of a contract. He was Milo, with his familiar weight, his specific laugh, his habit of clutching Remy's shirt in sleep. Remy stayed as close as they would let him. He sat by the bed, one hand gently wrapped around Milo's, his thumb tracing small circles across the too hot skin. When the nurses and doctors finished their initial rush and the room settled into the slow, uncertain rhythm of observation, a different pattern emerged. Each time Remy leaned over and gathered Milo carefully against his chest, monitors reacted. The child's pulse, too fast and jagged, began to slow by fractions. His breathing, shallow and disorganized, smoothed out, matching imperfectly but clearly the rise and fall of Remy's own chest. His oxygen levels steadied, ceasing their anxious dips. At first, a few staff members treated it as a touching coincidence. Then it repeated. When Remy tried to rest and stepped away for more than a short moment, Milo's agitation increased. His hands jerked, His face tightened. Even in feverish sleep, his heart rate ticked up. When Remy returned, touching his forehead or lifting him back against his body, the lines on the machines softened again. After the second hour, no one in the room dismissed it as just psychological. One of the nurses quietly pulled a curtain to give them more privacy and asked Remy, without any trace of judgment, to remain as much as he could. The hospital had rules, of course: visiting hours, infection protocols, formal categories. But medicine, when faced with a fragile system fighting on too many fronts, could also be pragmatic. If this Omega's presence regulated the child, then the Omega stayed. It was in that clinical humming space that the words came, which finally stripped the situation down to its truth. A specialist in early attachment, whom the pediatrician had been consulting since the first signs of Milo's unusual regulation patterns, arrived to observe. He was a quiet man with tired eyes, the kind who had seen too many families try to bend children to adult needs instead of the other way around. He watched without interrupting as Remy held Milo, as Gabriel hovered nearby, as the machines faithfully recorded the impact of each small change. Only then did he speak, directing his words mostly to Gabriel, but not pretending Remy was not there. He explained in calm, unadorned language that for this child, Remy was not a nanny with a special skill. He was one of two primary attachment figures, a central column holding up the architecture of Milo's emotional and physiological stability. Remove or sharply distance one of those columns, and the structure did not simply wobble. It cracked. He spoke of sensitive nervous systems, of early trauma from those first screaming weeks, of how Milo's body had learned to rely on specific signals of safety: Remy's heartbeat, Remy's smell, Remy's milk. The attempt to remove or even significantly reduce that presence in the name of appearances, he named for what it was in the language of his field: violence against the child's attachment system. Not the dramatic kind people imagined, but a subtle, pervasive violence that told the baby, again and again, that the world would choose rules over his need to feel safe. He did not accuse directly, but every example he offered felt like a blow. He pointed out the timing between the start of weaning and the spike in Milo's stress symptoms, between Remy's forced emotional withdrawal and the child's increase in agitation, between the moment the adults began to treat the breast as a problem and the moment the child began to unravel. In that same room, Remy's story finally stepped out of the shadow it had been living in. At the therapist's gentle prompting, he spoke. At first, he focused on Milo, describing symptoms, sleep patterns, reactions. Then, the questions shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward him. Had he been pregnant before? Had he ever breastfed? What had that experience been like? The words cost him, but they came. He told them about the pregnancy that had ended in blood and silence, about the way his body had been prepared to feed and hold and comfort, only to be dismissed by a flat line and a chart note, about how his system had never truly been allowed to complete what it had started. Lactation, he said slowly, had become more than physiology for him. It was, in some quiet, stubborn way, his body's attempt to finish a sentence that had once been cut off mid-word. Nursing Milo was not only about the child's survival, it was about his own repair, about stitching together a story that had been left torn. Gabriel listened like a man watching the far side of the moon emerge from shadow. Until then, Remy had existed in his mind as an indispensable worker, a man whose body held a unique solution to a problem no one else could fix. He had admired him, resented him, depended on him, but he had not truly seen him. Now, sitting in that stark hospital chair, with monitors beeping and Milo's frail hand clutching Remy's shirt even in feverish sleep, he saw a person whose scars ran as deep as his own. A person who had not simply stepped into their lives as a convenient answer, but who was, in his own way, risking himself every day in that nursery. The night in the hospital did not bring decisions. It brought questions that refused to be covered again. As the hours dragged past and the fever slowly, grudgingly began to respond to treatment, each of them found themselves alone inside their own thoughts, even in the same room. Gabriel stared at his son's face and wondered how much longer he could let other people's expectations dictate his parenting. Remy watched Milo's chest rise and fall against his own and asked himself how many more times he could survive being pushed to the edge of losing a child. Between them, the unspoken question settled like a third presence in the room. Were they willing to go back to a world where councils, shareholders, and whispered rules decided what was acceptable, if the price was the mind and body of the small boy lying between them, clinging to their scents and voices, as if they were the only solid things left? The days in the hospital stretched and folded into each other, marked less by clocks and more by the slow changes in Milo's chart. Fever spikes that grew shorter, lab results that shifted from alarming to merely watchful. The relentless beeping of monitors that, little by little, lost their urgency. For Gabriel, it was the first time in years that he was forced to sit still with nothing to do but wait. There were no meetings to command, no deals to mediate, no numbers to bend to his will. There was only a chair by the window and the sight of his son in a metal hospital cot, tethered to tubes, and an Omega who looked like he should have been a patient himself, and yet remained standing. He watched Remy move through each day on a kind of borrowed strength. The Omega's shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. His steps slowed when he crossed the room alone, but the moment Milo shifted restlessly, he was on his feet. Again and again he rose from the chair or the narrow visitor's bed, gathered the child against his chest, and began that same careful rocking that had once silenced a house. They spoke little at first. Their exhaustion lived too close to the surface, ready to spill if touched. The room was filled instead with small sounds: Milo's uneven breathing, the faint rustle of sheets when Remy adjusted his position, the distant hallway noises of other people's crises. But hospital time has a way of stripping away the decorative layers around people. It narrows life down to what actually matters. One evening, when the fever had finally receded to a low, watchful warmth, and Milo slept lying on his side across Remy's lap, Gabriel broke the silence. He stared at his son's face for a long time before the words came. "I was taught to put the personal in brackets," he said quietly, "to stay functional no matter what I felt. If something hurt, you worked more. If something scared you, you made a plan. I thought I could do the same with him. With my own child, the admission felt like dropping a stone into deep water." Remy listened, his hand resting gently on Milo's back. He swallowed once, hard, before answering. "They taught me almost the opposite," he said. "That my feelings did not matter as long as I was useful. That I was always the second choice, the backup plan. If I started wanting something for myself, it meant I was ungrateful." He blinked quickly, as if pushing back tears out of long habit rather than from lack of feeling. "So I learned to disappear," he added, "to be the hands that help, not the person anyone chooses to keep." The honesty between them hung in the room, fragile but solid. It was more intimate than any confession either of them had ever made in polished offices or over expensive dinners. The attachment therapist joined some of these conversations, sitting in the third chair like a quiet witness. Officially, he was there to monitor Milo's progress and advise on the child's needs. Unofficially, it became clear that he was also holding space for something that looked very much like family therapy, even though no one had yet dared to call it that. Without accusation, he pointed out patterns, how Gabriel's instinct to hide behind logic and numbers had led him to treat his son as another problem to be solved instead of a person to be met. How Remy's lifelong training to keep himself small had made it easier for others to treat him as a disposable solution rather than a central figure. He spoke about attachment as a system that did not end with the child, about how being drawn into caring for a baby reopens old wounds in adults, forces them to renegotiate their own histories, about the simple, uncomfortable truth that the decisions they made to please families and partners had been injuring not only Milo, but also the parts of themselves that had finally started to reach for more. One evening, the therapist had just left and the room was washed in the gray light of early night. Milo slept against Remy's chest, IV line taped carefully along his arm. His face, at last, looked like that of a resting child, not a battlefield. Gabriel sat at the foot of the bed, elbows on his knees, and spoke without looking up. "If my family and my partners cannot accept that my son has two important adults," he said slowly, "an alpha and an omega, then maybe the problem is not here. maybe it is with them. The words were not polished. They did not sound like a speech. They sounded like something inside him cracking in order to heal differently. Remy heard more in them than a vague statement about priorities. In that quiet defiance, he heard a promise that extended past the hospital walls, a promise that his body, his milk, his presence would no longer be treated as a shameful secret or a temporary glitch, but as part of a system Gabriel was prepared to defend. His own chest, tender and marked by Milo's need, no longer felt like a liability. It felt like a living proof that he mattered in a way that could not be easily replaced. In one of their sessions, the therapist finally said aloud what had been forming beneath the surface. "Remy is not a temporary intervention," he said. "He is a primary attachment figure. For Milo, he is already a parent in everything but law." The word caught in both of them. Parent. If Gabriel truly wanted to live according to the truths they had discovered here, the therapist continued, he would eventually have to acknowledge that not only in his heart but also in the structures outside, in documents, in decisions, in the way he introduced Remy to the world, the idea frightened them both, though for different reasons. For Gabriel, it meant stepping into direct conflict with his family and a segment of his business circle. It meant facing the full force of their disappointment and anger, not because he had failed in a deal, but because he had chosen a configuration of love they did not understand. For Remy, it meant something almost more terrifying, being asked to believe that he could be written into someone's life in ink, not pencil, that he could be given a role that could not be taken away with a polite dismissal and a severance envelope. Meanwhile, Milo's body did what bodies were designed to do when given time and support. His temperature dropped, hovering near normal. The circles under his eyes lightened. The lab results slowly slid back into harmless ranges. When the doctor finally spoke of discharge, it was with clear, firm instructions. No abrupt changes, no further experiments with weaning until Milo himself showed signs of readiness. No rearrangements of attachment to satisfy any external gaze. Whatever structure had brought him back from the edge now had to be protected as the priority, not treated as a problem to fix. On the morning of their release, the hospital corridor smelled less like fear and more like disinfectant and stale coffee. Papers were signed, prescriptions handed over, checkups scheduled. Remy wrapped Milo in a soft blanket, careful of the healing marks on his small hand where the IV had been. As he stepped out of the room, the weight of the child settled against him in a way his body now knew as home. For a heartbeat, he paused in the doorway and looked back. At the bed, at the monitor stand, at the pale walls that, in his memory, had once been the backdrop to loss. The last time he had left a hospital like this, his arms had been empty and his chest had ached with milk that no one would ever drink. He had walked out then feeling like a story that had been cut off mid-sentence. Now he stepped through the threshold, carrying a child who sighed in his sleep and nuzzled closer to his scent. Beside him walked an alpha who, for the first time, did not try to hide behind a mask of control. The hospital, which had been a symbol of failure and endings, had become something else, a place where they had been forced to choose, not between scandal and image, but between other people's comfort and the reality of the small heartbeat pressed between them. Coming home from the hospital did not lift the weight pressing in from outside. Inside their small triangle, things had become almost painfully clear. Outside, everything grew murkier. News of Milo's hospitalization leaked faster than any of them could have imagined. For those already convinced that something wrong was happening in the Ayers house, it became fuel. Whispers hardened into questions. Questions turned into demands. The family council insisted on a full meeting. No postponements, no excuses. Gabriel stepped into the conference room he knew too well, expecting charts, projections, new markets. Instead, the table was covered with printed articles, screenshots, drafts of gossip columns, anonymous comments circled in red. In several of them, the same idea repeated, dressed up in sly phrases. In the house of a very influential alpha, it said, there was an omega who played too large a role in the life of his son. The tone of this council was different from all the previous ones. The polite facade was thinner, the fear underneath it thicker. Older relatives spoke of obligations to the family name, to the business, to generations of people who had carried that name through scandals they had managed to avoid. They cited examples of other alphas who had put their private lives in order when it mattered, who had quietly removed inconvenient partners, reshaped households to look correct. Some of the company's senior figures, invited in as if this were another strategic discussion, talked about risk and stability. They warned him that investors rarely distinguished between personal choices and leadership capacity. They drew verbal lines between respectable family configurations and those that confused the public. The pressure came dressed in many costumes, appeals to duty, reminders of everything he had been given, veiled threats about future roles in the corporation. When the conversation shifted to Remy and Milo, the mask slipped completely. An uncle, emboldened by the rising tension, let out the sentence that split the air in the room. "Omegas come and go," he said with a dismissive wave. "The air remains." He meant it as a simple hierarchy. To Gabriel, it sounded like someone putting a price tag on human beings he saw every day. In that one sentence, Remy was reduced to a replaceable part, a function to be swapped out when convenient. Milo was a symbol, not a child who had clung to life in a hospital bed. Listening, Gabriel realized that if he stayed silent now, he would be agreeing not just to a plan, but to a definition of his son and the man who had saved him. Something inside him, worn down by years of compliance, finally refused to bend. He pushed the folders of paper aside, letting some of the printed pages slide off the table and flutter to the floor. The movement was small, but in this room, it sounded louder than a shout. Then, for the first time in his adult life, he said the one thing no one there expected to hear. "I choose them," he said, "not the image, the real family I already have." He felt the shock in the silence that followed, like an intake of breath shared by everyone else. He did not dress it up with polite qualifiers. He said plainly that he would not repeat the experiment with weaning that had pushed his son to the edge. He would not sever Milo's bond with Remy to satisfy anyone's discomfort. He would follow the recommendations of the doctors and the attachment specialist, not the fears of people who had never been in that hospital room. If relatives or partners found that unacceptable, they were free to reconsider their place in his life and in his business. He could feel his own heart pounding as he spoke, but that physical fear no longer mattered. The decision had been made in the hospital at 3 a.m, with Milo's fingers curled in Remy's shirt. Here, he was only giving it language. What he said next carried them all into a different world. He informed the council that he intended to formalize Remy's role in Milo's life, not as staff, not as a temporary caregiver, as a legally recognized caregiving adult, a co-guardian in everything that concerned the child's health and daily life, with rights, responsibilities, and a voice that could not be silenced by a simple dismissal. In their protected environment, this was nothing less than an earthquake. Some reacted with almost theatrical outrage. An aunt spoke of madness and giving away power. A cousin accused him of setting a precedent that other Omegas might exploit. A board representative coldly pointed out that legal recognition would make it much harder to correct course later without public fallout. But Gabriel did not retreat. He had done that too many times, quietly bending his will to fit their story. Now he simply listened, nodded where politeness demanded, and did not change his stance. When he left the meeting, the pressure was still there. Threats hung in the air, some subtle, some less so. There were warnings about lost investments, about rival branches of the family waiting eagerly for an excuse to replace him. Yet for the first time, he walked out of that room not feeling smaller, but clearer. At home, telling Remy was harder than confronting the council had been. He found the Omega in the nursery, Milo asleep against his chest, head tucked under his chin. The sight of them still hit him with the same mix of humility and fierce protectiveness. Gabriel explained, as simply as he could, what he had said, what he wanted to do. At first, Remy did not understand. The words legal status and co-guardian sounded like they belonged to someone else's story. His first reaction was refusal. He imagined the backlash, not in abstract terms, but in vivid details. Being blamed if anything ever went wrong. Having his name dragged through circles he had spent his entire life on the outskirts of. bearing the weight of responsibility someone could at any moment decide he did not deserve. Fear rose like an old tide. He had been cut off before. He knew how quickly admiration could turn into resentment. But when he looked down, Milo had stirred at the unfamiliar tension in the room. Half asleep, the boy's hand reached blindly, catching in the fabric of Remy's shirt as if to anchor himself. When he heard Gabriel's voice, low and steady, he squirmed, turning slightly toward the sound. Remy looked from the child to the Alpha. For the first time, there was no flicker of doubt in Gabriel's eyes, no apologetic distance, no hint that he might later recast this as a misunderstanding. Only determined calm. "This is not another contract line," Gabriel said quietly. "This is us deciding who you already are to him." It was not poetic, but it was true. The process of turning that truth into reality was slow and demanding. Lawyers had to be convinced, then instructed to think beyond their usual templates. They drafted documents that did not fully match any existing model. Not adoption, not simple employment, not the classic family registration. Something in between, tailored to a child with a documented attachment profile and a non-traditional network of care. The therapist wrote a detailed report describing Remy's role in Milo's regulation and development. The pediatrician added his own statement, outlining the medical risks of disrupting that bond. Their words turned what had once been dismissed as just emotional into expert evidence. Each meeting with the legal team, each revision of clauses and definitions, felt like hammering another nail into the structure they were building. Not a rebellion for its own sake, but a careful, deliberate acknowledgement of reality. Around this scaffolding of papers, life continued. Between drafts and signatures, notaries' visits and quiet arguments over phrasing, something else shifted almost unnoticed. Gabriel began to spend more time in the nursery than in his office. He still worked, still took calls, but more often than not they found him sitting on the floor, laptop beside him, Milo crawling over his legs while Remy folded tiny clothes at the dresser. Remy, without quite realizing it, stopped addressing him in the overly formal way he had used at first. The distance in his voice softened. He started to say simple things like, "You look tired," without apologizing for noticing. Their conversations stretched beyond feeding schedules and medical appointments. They asked each other how the day had felt, not just what had happened. Gabriel found himself talking about the way his world had narrowed in the hospital, how strange it was to discover that losing a contract seemed trivial compared to the thought of losing his son. Remy admitted that, for the first time, he sometimes caught himself imagining a future longer than the next paycheck. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden declaration of love. What grew between them did so quietly, woven into mundane moments. The exchange of a knowing look when Milo did something new, the shared exhaustion at the end of a hard day, the warmth of standing side by side in the kitchen at night, each with a mug of something hot, listening to the silence of a house that no longer felt hostile. By the time the final version of the documents lay waiting for their signatures, the choice Gabriel had made at the council meeting was no longer theoretical. He saw it every time he entered the nursery and felt the atmosphere in the room settle around the three of them, like something that fit. Reputation was still out there, restless and demanding, knocking at the windows with questions and rumors. But inside, Milo reached for two people when he cried, an Alpha and an Omega, both of whom had nearly lost him once and were no longer willing to sacrifice him to anyone's expectations. A year had passed. Milo was no longer the red, trembling knot of nerves that had once screamed himself hoarse against the world. The echoes of those nights still lived somewhere deep in the walls of the house, but now they were drowned out more often by laughter. His, high and bright, cutting through the corridors like sunlight, he had grown into a small, determined creature with unsteady legs and quick hands. He pulled himself up on furniture, shuffled along the edge of the sofa, then, one evening, let go. His first steps were more like controlled falls, feet slapping against the soft rug, arms thrown forward for balance. Each time he wobbled, he turned his head instinctively, searching for two faces, an Alpha and an Omega. Sometimes he ran, in his uneven toddler way, straight at Gabriel, who would brace himself and catch him, lifting him high until the boy shrieked with delight. Sometimes he veered toward Remy, who knelt and opened his arms, letting Milo collide with his chest and bury his face in his shirt. Most of the time, Milo did not choose between them because he did not need to. They were both there. That was the point. Breastfeeding had ended months ago, not in a rupture, but in a slow, careful unwinding. They had watched for Milo's cues the way sailors watch the sea, alert for change. One day, he simply took less, distracted midway by a toy. Another day, he fussed less when offered a cup instead. Remy and the doctors tracked his reactions, ready to stop if the old panic surfaced. It did not. The day Remy realized Milo no longer reached for his chest in fear, only in affection, he sat on the edge of his bed and let himself grieve in private for a long time. It was an ending and a proof. The child no longer needed his body as a shield against the world. He needed his presence, his smell, his voice. The foundation they had built in those exhausting months had done its work. Milo's system could now hold the world without collapsing into screaming. On paper, their strange configuration had hardened into something recognized. Remy's name appeared in documents where, a few years earlier, no one like him would have been allowed. As a caregiving adult, he could sign medical forms, attend parent consultations, be present in any room where decisions about Milo were made. Nurses and administrators no longer asked him to wait outside with the staff. If someone hesitated, there was a piece of paper with seals that said clearly, "He belongs in this conversation." Every time he picked up a pen to sign "responsible party," his hand shook for a second. The first dozen signatures felt like stepping onto thin ice and waiting for a crack. It never came. The world, which he had expected to explode, simply adjusted around the new fact of his existence. His relationship with Gabriel had followed a similar hesitant pattern. The crisis had welded them together out of necessity. Survival had turned into cooperation, cooperation into respect, respect into gratitude too deep to be spoken easily. What came after that was slower, quieter. There were no grand gestures. Love, if that was the word for it, grew in small, specific acts. When Milo woke coughing late one night, feverish from a simple childhood infection, Remy spent hours by his bed, wiping his forehead, humming under his breath. At some point he sagged in the chair, sleep dragging at him. He woke later under a blanket that had not been there before, a mug of tea cooling on the table beside him. Gabriel had passed through the room like a ghost, covering him, checking on the boy, leaving what comfort he could. When a deal collapsed because Gabriel refused to cut a social project he believed in, he came home with his shoulders tight and his jaw locked. The old version of him would have swallowed his frustration and gone straight back to work. This time, he found Remy sitting on the floor with Milo, building shaky towers out of blocks. He sat down beside them, and when Milo wandered off, leaving the tower half done, Remy did not say, "I told you so," did not offer advice about business. He just said, "That must have hurt," and put his hand over Gabriel's where it lay on his knee. For a long moment they sat like that, pressed side by side, breathing the same air. Outside, the world remained imperfect. Some relatives kept their distance, attending obligatory gatherings with polite smiles, then leaving as soon as it was acceptable. They sent gifts for Milo through assistants rather than bringing them themselves. In company corridors, jokes about the sentimental alpha surfaced now and then, born out of discomfort more than malice. A few deals did slide away to competitors whose family portraits looked more traditional on glossy brochures, but the collapse many had predicted never came. The company did not fall because its head refused to sacrifice a child for optics. In time, some partners, worn down by their own carefully staged lives, began to treat Gabriel differently. They sought him out not in spite of his choices, but because of them. There was a certain relief, it turned out, in working with someone who had already survived being called soft and had not broken. Inside the house, their world found its own rhythm. Evenings were no longer battles against endless crying. They were a series of small rituals. Milo's bath, laughter echoing off tile as he splashed, the slow, sleepy weight of him in a towel, head dropping onto whichever shoulder was closer. Stories read in a soft voice, sometimes by Remy, sometimes by Gabriel, sometimes haltingly by both when the day had left them ragged. After Milo fell asleep, one of them would always linger a little longer. Some nights it was Remy sitting on the floor, back against the side of the crib, watching the rise and fall of the small chest in the dim light of the night lamp. Other nights it was Gabriel, his hand resting lightly on the mattress, anchoring himself as much as the child. Sometimes they ended up there together. They sat in comfortable silence, shoulders brushing, listening to the steady breathing that had once been a fragile thing monitored by machines and now filled the room with a calm so precious it felt sacred. That sound had become, for both of them, the answer to every question about whether the fights, the accusations, the legal battles had been worth it. Remy would think about the first cry he had heard in that clinic, the one that had cut through walls and into his bones. He remembered leaving a hospital once with empty arms and milk his body had no one to give to. He contrasted it with this. Leaving the hospital with a child pressed to his chest and an alpha walking at his side, both of them changed. Gabriel would think about the day he had believed parenthood was another project, something to manage and polish for others to admire. He remembered the moment when he had stood in a hospital room and realized his son did not care about the family name, the company, the markets. Milo cared only about warmth, scent, heartbeat. He looked now at the two people who had taught him that lesson and felt something like gratitude and terror woven together. The family they had built did not fit into the neat diagrams his relatives preferred. It had not been planned, negotiated, or announced with perfect photographs. It had been born out of a cry that no one could stop, out of a body that dared to break a taboo, and out of a decision to place a living child above any rule. If you stayed with this story until the end, remind yourself that family does not always arrive in the classic order: alpha, omega, child, stamp. Sometimes it arrives out of sequence and off script. Sometimes it is forged in hospital corridors and sleepless nights, in the shaking hands of someone who chooses to feed again, and in the voice of someone who finally says enough to a whole system. Write in the comments whose choice in this story felt strongest to you. Remy's decision to let his body love and nourish again, Gabriel's decision to stand against his family and the rules of his world, or Milo's wordless insistence through his cries and his quiet on where the truth really was. And do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you will not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even the most unconventional choices can lead to honest, living love.